Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you happen to be around the world. I'm Shane, and it's really exciting for me to introduce my friend, co founder, occasional antagonist, Josh Goldbard, who is the CEO of MobileCoin. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Really delighted to be talking to you, Shane. I'm really delighted to introduce Shane. Shane is my co-founder at MobileCoin. He is now adjunct professor at UC Hastings in San Francisco. I really am delighted to talk with Shane because I think Shane's pretty knowledgeable about crypto for a variety of reasons. One, from having made a cryptocurrency with me, he was the person who helped design the regulatory architecture of MobileCoin, but also just because he is I'll describe this as vaguely obsessive about just having like a high level overview of topics. And so I think his range on crypto is pretty broad.
Lately I've realized that you can learn so much from crypto Twitter that like I don't know if there's a better resource to actually get a good kind of flavor for what's going on than to
Well,
just
for better and for worse, right? You know?
hey, this is since we're talking about it, this is going to be my plug, which is that, if anyone can get me a ticket to the e-girl capital party in New York at the end of January, hit me up. But so we're here today to kind of talk about that, to talk about, a little bit about what happened last year in the crypto world. What we think is, or what you think is going to be going on in the next year. So talk about some of the big things that have happened. The whole Terra Luna ecosystem, collapse and reboot. So maybe you could just give us, say, a couple things about your impression of crypto in 2021. Like, there was so much happened, so much
Man,
got built. What really pops out to you?
it's almost like the last year and a half collapsed in the last month, is how I would describe it in terms of just
Yeah.
sort of the world, right? Like, I think everybody's been building, right? And at a certain
Hmm.
point, there becomes like a level of hype in crypto, and then there's these epochs that happen that sort of like reset the playing field. We've seen this a number of times. There's sort of these events that like catalyze a winter, and I
Hmm.
think Terra is the most recent one. But if you go back, there are different things that have happened. China banning Bitcoin for the fifth time. There's sort of different events like China getting rid of mining that also caused the hash rate on Bitcoin to go way down, although mining's back up in China now. So I think what I've noticed is that there are these periods of time where hype starts to dominate crypto. And all you hear
Hmm.
about is sort of like the echo chamber of things that make, I think, little economic sense or little rational sense. And they balloon and they sort of like take up all the oxygen in the room. And then at a certain point, some event happens that causes that value to sort of collapse. And all that's
Hmm.
left are the projects that are actually building real things. And so
Yeah.
what I see what I see is like things like NFTs, that is a cyclic market. There are some NFTs that are kind of like blue chip NFTs that are going to be around for the next cycle. There's like board apes, things like that. Those are going to be around for the next cycle. But then there's a lot of projects that are kind of just fly by night, right? And they get really loud and then they stop being loud when an event like Terra happens. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
It does. It does. And on NFTs, not that I'm personally invested in this, but what's your prediction? Pudgy penguins, are they going to stick around, or
I mean,
or do I
it's
need to go over to OpenSea and dump them right now? No.
You know, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the specifics of the NFT market to give an opinion on that. What I can say
Yeah.
is like there are things that I hear really loudly, like Beeple, things like Bored Ape Yacht Club that I hear really loudly, and then there are a lot of things that I hear once or twice, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And I think that, the whole, in 2021, we saw this huge burst of generative art, NFTs. Although I know a lot of the category of generative art is, at this point, 50, 60 years old. But we saw a bunch of generative art come out. We saw a bunch of PFPs come out, and now we're seeing people trying to like build on top of that, because there's a market of a certain size for things like PFPs, but trying to connect them to a broader ecosystem of media is definitely on the horizon.
Well, so there's NFTs are, I think, super interesting for a variety of reasons because of the fact that like you can have something on an immutable blockchain that you can prove ownership of, and it can have
Hmm.
attributes. They're sort of like, playing cards that you can take with you anywhere on the internet, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to imagine like doing an ID on an NFT, right? So Vitalik has this whole concept of soulbound NFTs, right? And
Hmm.
the soulbound NFT is an NFT that you can't get rid of on your account. And I find that to be super fit as something where it's only editable by a government resource, and that could be your ID on Ethereum or something like that.
Yep.
But also, it could be the mark of Cain. Like you could, get an OFAC token on your Ethereum account, and now your account is just banned forever. Like that, maybe that
Digital
account
scarlet letter.
yeah, digital scarlet letter. And that's probably not an intended consequence of what he's designing, right?
Yeah, so I think that's so. Me being the lawyer, when I first started hearing about soulbound NFTs, like aside from the obvious hook into like high quality items from games like WoW and Guild Wars 2, which is kind of where that soulbound concept came from. I immediately thought about like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if like rather than me having to send all of my personal identity to like every exchange I deal with, wouldn't it be cool
Yeah.
if I could just do my KYC verification and maybe my like country of origin and other kinds of verifications with one group? Maybe I can pick a verification group that I trust, and then other and then like when I deal with a new exchange, I send them tokens from an account that has the soulbound verification NFT, and they just check that programmatically, and they're like, oh, okay, he did KYC 2 months ago. That's good enough for our standards. And that means I
Well,
don't have to send my driver's license to another company that's going to lose it.
well, here's the problem, right? The problem is the same problem they have with soulbound items in World of Warcraft. And that's that you
Yeah, you
can
just
give
sell the account.
password. You give your password away, right? You sell your
Yeah,
password on eBay.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's even worse in the case where it's KYC, right? Because now you have an account that verifies it's Shane without
Mhm.
it actually being Shane.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it still has problems, but I think as like a primitive that people can build on top of, I think it's super super cool. You were talking about cycles, and I feel like there's a couple of interesting cycles in crypto. Like there's the broadly speaking, there's the every 4 years in December cycle for like Bitcoin all time highs. Like we had an
Yep.
all time high in 2013, we had an all time high in 2017, we had an all time high perhaps in 2021. But there's also we and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. We had a big DeFi summer in
Yeah.
2020. That
Yeah.
was when Sushi Swap came out. And yeah, Uniswap really took off. Uniswap was developed
You know,
way
in
prior to
Asia,
that.
it was like about a year or two ahead of that, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. But then you had Sushi Swap come out, and that's when a lot of people first heard about Sam Bankman-Fried because he kind of saved Sushi Swap. And
Yep.
then last summer there was the what the traders were calling the Solu AVAX trade, where you had these three alt L1s took off. A couple of them are still doing really well. Like now it's we're recording this on June 1st. It's the start of summer in the northern hemisphere. Like, do you think we're gonna see another wave, either a DeFi wave,
Well, on what time
alt
frame,
L1
right?
wave? What?
On what time frame, right?
Oh, I just
So
mean like, what do you think is going to be the thing in 2022? Like, do you think there's going to be a summer
well,
2022 pickup?
okay.
And then if there is, where do you think it's going to be?
So it's the question is like how independent of like global trends is crypto?
I think
And
maybe we should just go there with the question to see that
yeah,
this is the first time that crypto has existed in as an industry in a broader bear market, because we haven't
well,
really had a serious bear market since
so
2008.
Ken
Bitcoin came
Griffin
out
at
in 2009.
Ken Griffin at Citadel is actually saying that he doesn't think we're going to head into a recession this year. He doesn't think we're going
Really?
to head into a recession next year. And he could just be talking his book, right? Talking his book is a phrase that every investor, every trader has a set of assets that are on their book, and they always say the things that are true about making their assets more valuable. And
Yep.
so I think when Ken is saying we're not going to have a recession, he's making a bet in that direction as an organization, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a chance he's right. But I do think at some point in the future, we'll have a more bearish economic condition. I've just realized that if you bet a year from now whether the stock market is going to be up or down, you're almost always wrong. There are a handful of years where the stock market is down a year from now, and most years it's up. And so
Yeah.
trying to predict when you're going to have a like truly bear market is a fool's errand.
Yeah.
So I guess my perspective on this is that absent a like broader economic recession in the world, I think that crypto is going to be this one of the strongest asset classes in terms of growth. I think we're going to see that crypto is going to be something where people, if you look, it's where the energy is, right? It's where the attention
Mhm.
is. It's where the smartest people are starting to work now. And I think we're only going to see more of that. Like Andreessen Horowitz just loaded up with another $4.5 billion as a fund. I think the amount of investment that's coming into the space is just gargantuan. And
Mhm.
so my opinion is that crypto is a moment of winter right now. And in the winter, we build. And the
Yeah.
things that come out of winter are the strongest things in crypto.
Yeah. Yeah. And just on the numbers, I was checking the news this morning and um, I saw a summary published, was reported that the sort of total, and I would say the total Western VC investments in crypto. I don't think this reporter necessarily picked up a bunch of the Chinese funds, but the total their calculated total 2021 investments in crypto startups was $30 billion, which is by far the biggest per year.
That's a
Like
lot of money.
that's yeah, I mean that's real money. That's real money in sort of traditional VC backed startups. Like
And
it'd be interesting.
that's only the deals you can see, right? Like there's all the deals
Exactly.
that happen behind closed doors for coins. There's all the deals that happen for secondary equity. Like the total amount of money that's in the space is much bigger than that.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I think $30 billion that kind of puts VC crypto investments on the same sort of footing as like automated driving
Yeah.
investments as a category, or like alternative banking as a category, things like that. So that's I think that's that will probably play out this year as well.
So you have a combination of a space where a lot of smart people are working now, and
Mhm.
also a regulatory wilderness in a lot of places. Like if you told me 5 years in a mobile coin that there would still not be crypto law in the United States, I think both of us would have thought that was crazy. Yet here we are. And it's hard to predict when regulation is going to come down. I think
Mhm.
we've all been kind of, almost holding our breath for a while, wondering what the regulation is going to look like. And as far as I can tell, there isn't a major push for regulation right now. Like there is a lot of people who are talking about it. There's a lot of sort of like preliminary drafts of things, but it doesn't feel like there's a big push to do it this year. And we can always be wrong. You never know what the government's going to do, but it certainly feels like regulation is a little bit far out from where we are right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if there was going to be any area of movement, and this is a nice segue, it would be in stable coins, just
Yes.
because of the size of certain stablecoin products. We've got Tether is up 70, $80 billion. You've got Circle is up. I forget what they're at, but there's something around 50. You've got we're starting to get like 100 billion, $200 billion in dollar stablecoins floating around. So with that, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say part of this is that UST, and we should go talk about Terra for a second, but
Yeah,
part of the issue is that UST was not like it impacted Americans. Don't get me wrong. Like it
yeah,
certainly impacted Americans, but a lot of the losses were felt in Asia. I would say the
yeah.
majority of the losses were felt in Korea and Asia and surrounding countries. And I think that that has led there to be sort of a feeling of we need to do something about this in regulation, but
Mhm.
not a Americans lost their life savings sort of feeling. And certainly some of them did, but I would say that the
Yeah,
majority of the impact was felt outside the United States. I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
know whether that would be true in the case of a Tether collapse. If Tether were to collapse, I think a lot of Americans would be really hurt by that.
yeah, yeah. I would agree. And you and I have been discussing online and offline. You and I have been talking about Tether for privately
I don't know,
like
7 years?
20 yeah, 75 years, 7 years, something like that. But let's talk a little bit about what happened with the Luna ecosystem, because I know you're very plugged in to world, you interact
So,
with a lot of the exchange people, you interact with a lot of the people running projects. So what was your take on sort of what happened with
so
UST?
I was in the Bahamas for FTX Bahamas, where there's the SALT conference that's thrown with Anthony Scaramucci, and I was speaking there, and I was in a room with a lot of the top traders in the world. And what struck me is how many of them were just saying that, Luna's going to be fine. And this is at the same moment
Mm,
where the Luna Foundation Guard Fund is starting to deplete on Bitcoin. And you can see there's like sort of like a rapid sort of feeling of like, what is going on here? And you look at like the timeline of when that all that stuff was happening, you could see that Luna was on a trajectory to run out of money to support the peg. And that was like evident at the time. And here you are in a room with the top traders, and they're just saying, this is going to be fine. And there's a version of reality where they're just saying that while they're getting ready in position to put a short on. Like there's a version of reality where that's the case. They're just saying one thing and doing another. And then there's a version of reality where they didn't react. And I was surprised to realize that many of the top traders in the world simply didn't react. And I think
interesting.
there's a paralysis that happens in these moments where it is very hard for people who are very close to the market to see something that people who are less close to the market can see. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting moment where I think a lot of traders in those moments of everybody's sort of doing the same thing, there's a herd mentality where it takes a lot to break away and say, you're not part of the herd, you're doing something different.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an amount of energy that you have to put in to just change direction, and it's hard for people to do that. So I think that contributes to these sort of like mega collapses. It's just people saying, "Oh, well, there are smarter people who are doing the same thing I am." And
Hmm.
at some point, you have to look around and say, "Okay, well, if all the smart people are doing one thing, are they really smart?"
Yeah. That reminds me a lot of some of the biggest disasters in areas like backcountry skiing. Um, will
Yeah,
happen when you have a group of really, really good skiers and everyone assumes that someone else checked out the risk and figured out what the danger was. And that's where you have, an avalanche that rolls up, 15 or 20 people. And then there's always like really, really experienced people because everyone thought somebody else did the safety check. Yeah, I think between May 8 and May 10, I probably only got like 5 hours of sleep. I wasn't trading that, but I just thought I was like, this is going to be a singular event in sort of the history of cryptocurrency, and I just wanted to
well,
watch it happen.
so what's super interesting about it is that Luna actually had a very interesting mechanic in the design of Luna and UST. And
Hmm.
that mechanic was that if you tried to withdraw too much UST too quickly, there was a penalty for doing so. But
Yeah,
this is only enforced on chain. And
yeah,
so the problem they had is that they listed UST and Luna outside of the chain. And this meant that the things that occurred in the centralized exchange did not have this slowdown mechanic to prevent a bank run. And this caused basically a collapse that couldn't be intermediated on chain. And what I love about this and what I find is so fascinating is that the main reason that this was possible is that Luna does not have control of centralized exchanges. And this is
hmm,
the problem with stablecoins that have algorithmic pegs. They can't exert regulatory control on centralized entities. And the centralized entity, their trading of that asset can get out of sync with the on chain asset, and then you have an explosion.
yeah,
And
yeah. And
there's
you can
just no way to
draw,
stop it.
yeah, and you can draw a direct relationship between that attempt at regulation, or attempt at enforcing a peg, and sort of what national governments do when they have like an official exchange rate. Like, for a long time, Venezuela had an official exchange, or they think they still do have an official exchange rate with the U.S. dollar, but anyone who can avoid it does. And for a long time, there used to be one guy with like a amateur economist on the side. A guy living in Florida had like a website where he would publish what he thought the actual exchange rate was based on just like calling a bunch of people.
Yeah.
So it's almost impossible to enforce a peg like that unless you actually can exert control over all of the places and all of the people who are going to be
Well, you have to be
buying and
able to
selling.
stop a bank run, right? You have to be able to
Yeah,
stop a bank run. And
yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
yeah,
happens in a traditional institution like a bank where the people try to withdraw too much money at once. They just stop processing withdrawals until people calm
yeah.
down. right?
Yeah.
And that's something that you can't do in a decentralized world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can tell you, like, as someone who had all of their money in Washington Mutual Bank in 2008, I remember that. I
Right.
remember one day, like, I think it was like a Thursday, like going to the ATM and it just didn't work. So
Yeah.
part of the reason why I'm in crypto.
I mean, this is the thing when you have these stress conditions in the market, centralized entities just lock up, and
Yeah.
decentralized entities they do also lock up sometimes. So DAI, for example, there's a point where DAI their peg is based on ETH, if I'm not mistaken, and
Hmm.
the value of ETH started to collapse really dramatically, and so they just halted the burn mechanic in DAI and basically waited for Ethereum to go back up. And if Ethereum had not come back up in a sufficient time, they would have just shut down DAI.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really a fascinating project because I think that's maybe the most decentralized sort of stablecoin-ish kind of thing that's worked for the longest. I know it is, like, today, a large percentage of the backing is, in addition to ETH, is also, I think, USDC.
Yep.
So they've got some balance in there. So
Well,
do you
they're
have
just
any?
saying there's less variable risk, right? Like
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
let's say it's 95% collateralized with USDC and 5% collateralized with ETH, hypothetically, right? Now
Yeah,
you have a 5% volatility risk. So let's say ETH goes to zero. Now your
yeah,
stablecoin's trading at 95 cents. So there's always a
yep,
risk condition, but they're betting that, like, ETH isn't going to go to zero, which is probably, knock on wood while I say this, probably not going to happen.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So do you and I do want to talk about ETH a little bit because that's one of the other major things that, again, knock on wood, will be happening this year. But do you have any sorts of predictions or any thoughts on the on Luna 2? Or I guess now it's just Luna and the old
Can
version
we,
is
can we
Luna
just
Classic.
pause and talk about how crazy it is that Luna can have this sort of, like, meltdown, right? Like 99.9% losses like 3 days in a row, right?
Hmm.
And they can just say, we're going to reboot the network, and people go along with it.
Yeah.
Like, this is fascinating. Could you imagine if this was like a normal financial institution that blew up like this? And then the people who made it said, we're just reincorporating a new company and we're going to just call it, Bernie Madoff 2, right? And
Yeah,
maybe
that's that
maybe
that
it
meme
works.
floating around. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it works. Like, what is that world like? What
Well,
happens if
you
Luna returns a significant portion of value to the original Luna holders? Then what do you say?
well, that'd be great. Like if a lot of, especially a lot of the there were sort of retail people invested on the USD side. Like if they can come up with a mechanism where those people can receive most of their money back, I think that would be wonderful.
Well, what
Um,
if you just create an asset and people just think it's valuable? And
well, I
the old
mean,
asset, old asset was destroyed. The value is transferred
yep,
to another asset. And create a new asset, and people just think it's valuable. Then you just added more money into the total economy, right?
yeah. I mean, you're the person who for years and years and years have been telling me that money is just a collective belief. So maybe the Goldbard collective belief theory will prove out.
Well, it's a
Um,
collective belief in the sense that anything that's valuable is a belief system. But I think that
yeah.
there are some assets that have different belief systems than others, right? Some assets, like, you find a value in them because they increase productivity, they increase commerce, or they're backed up by the power of a nation state, right? And other
Mhm.
assets, they're just entertaining. And I think that's kind of like NFTs, Shiba, and Doge. They're just entertaining, and people like to be entertained. And I think it's really interesting to think about, like, what are the different things that support value in an economy.
Yeah, yeah. I heard an interview with oh, I can't remember who it was. I think it was the chairman of the Carlyle Group, and was asked about crypto, and he paused for a second. And he said, "Well, he's like, some traders just really like to watch the number move, and if you like watching the number move, the number moves more in crypto than it does anywhere else."
I think that's true, but also there are some real things that are being built in crypto. And I
Oh
think this
yeah.
is a good segue back to sort of like what's happening with ETH, Solana, MobileCoin as well. We're trying to make real products. We're trying to make
Hmm.
products that dramatically impact people's lives. And I think that Ethereum certainly has had an amount of change, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse, depending on your perspective. And I think that we're also going to see that with Solana and MobileCoin. I just want to
Hmm.
paint this picture where you have Ethereum. which is gradually sort of fixing the things that people don't like about Ethereum. They're trying to increase throughput, they're trying to get gas costs down, they're trying to get it to be, as close to carbon negative as they can. I think that last part's going to be really hard for them. But then you have Solana, which I think can't be carbon negative for a variety of reasons because of how big the servers are. But the throughput's faster, the number of transactions they can process is massive. And then you have things like MobileCoin, where we're not trying to solve the smart contracting issue, but we have delivered a very fast network that's carbon negative and very easy to use. And so I think
Hmm.
what you're going to have is these sort of like catch-all blockchains, which are solving, kind of the boil the ocean problem of like distributed computing. And then you have bespoke blockchains that are solving a specific problem, like payments. And
Right.
that's what MobileCoin is working on. I think we have a chance to achieve that just because of how small the problem domain is compared to the totality of distributed computing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so why don't you take a couple of minutes? And so I would love to hear your thoughts on the merge and maybe explain the merge a little bit in the Ethereum world. And it's kind of projected to go off this year. What you
This
think
is
that's
ETH
gonna
2.0.
that's
This is
gonna
ETH 2.0, not sharding, right?
yeah.
Okay.
The transition of the Ethereum network from being a proof of work chain to proof
All
of stake.
right.
Sure, I know the
So
merge means a lot of things, but just that piece of it. And then
yeah,
also, I'd love to hear if there's any information about sort of what's going on in the mobile coin world that you're able to share.
yeah. Let me talk about the merge. I think the first time I heard about proof of stake was 6 years ago. It might have been 6 years ago that I first heard Vitalik and Vlad start talking about this.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that it was like 9 months out at the time they started talking about it. And what I found about Ethereum is that no matter what Ethereum predicts in terms of timelines, it can go 10x the timeline, and nobody cares. What they care is that eventually it happens. And it's sort of this mythology of they're selling this story, they're talking about this vision. And if things take longer, it's okay because there's a belief in the ecosystem. This goes back to the collective belief. And what I think is happening is that there is some amount of delivering on the promise of Ethereum. And
Hmm.
that is something that the Ethereum economy, the participants in that system believe in, and they like to see that action come true. So I think that Ethereum will get to proof of stake. And I don't know what the
Hmm.
timeline will be, but it will happen. And I think that people will be excited about it because it happened. But I think the actuality of it, the user experience differences are going to be so small. I think
Hmm.
that those people who are using the Ethereum network aren't going to truly experience a difference in the proof of stake world versus proof of work. Like for most people, there's still going to be contract execution. It's still going to take, some amount of time to clear as a block. Fees might be lower. It's not yet
Hmm.
certain whether how much they're going to be lower. In fact, I think that there's this illusion that they're going to be like Solana cheap, and I just don't see that happening on Ethereum. I think the miners won't put up with it for a variety of reasons. So I don't think that the changes for individuals are going to be that broad on proof of stake, and I think there will be some backlash from that because there's always this tendency to believe that like this is going to be a cure-all, right? And the cure-all that Vitalik has always said is not at ETH 2.0. It's not ZK rollups. It's sharding. And Lord knows when we're going to see sharding hit the Ethereum chain. I don't know how many years out that's going to be. It's a while.
Right.
So I think people are going to be really excited that the merge occurs, and then there's going to be a sort of like disillusionment about it not more dramatically changing the Ethereum world, and that's okay. People that are actually using the network will stick around. And this is the
Yeah.
thing, in the winter, people build.
Right.
And that's what's happening in MobileCoin right now is that we're building. At MobileCoin, we're trying to deliver the Rosetta Stone for global commerce. And what that
Yeah.
means is anywhere you see the MobileCoin logo, it just works. And
Yep.
so that requires a lot of infrastructure build out. We're making mobile USD right now. We're getting to the point where you can actually interact with stable coins on the MobileCoin chain. And that's going to be really, really exciting because a lot of people want volatility. A lot of people want these fully sort of decentralized assets. And I think a lot of people also want the ability to have a predictable value when they open their wallet. And both of those customers are people we want to be able to work with at MobileCoin. So I think we are, knock on wood, dangerously close to that sort of starting to hit the world. We're going to see what the
Oh.
timelines look like on that, but I'm feeling very excited about it this year.
Okay. Now this is the part where I ask you when, and you say soon.
Soon, soon. You know,
Perfect.
there's no answer of like when these things are actually going to occur. They hit the blockchain when they hit the blockchain. But I
Yeah.
will say the synthetic asset PRs are already on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really love your adherence to John Carmack back when he was making video games. People used to always ask him, when is it coming out, and he would always say when it's ready.
Yeah, when it's ready.
So
I mean, as much as we want these things to just, snap your fingers and exist, ETH 2.0 is 6 years in the making.
yep,
It's
yep,
hard to make real technology. It's hard to make stuff that actually works.
yeah, and I think in crypto more so than in other software based industries, you have it's not like video games where you can ship a broken product and just assume everyone downloads a patch on day one. Like things need to go out the door with a higher level of quality than in
Well,
other areas of the world.
imagine if you had a blockchain and the keys weren't written correctly and the money got stolen. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, and we've seen that happen. We've seen
Well,
that
we've seen
happen
we've seen it happen in that
so
there
many
was a
times.
bug in the smart contract, right? But we
Yeah.
haven't really seen like the individual wallet keys were implemented in a way that people could just arbitrarily rob people's money out of
Ah,
wallets, right?
yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
as far
yeah.
as I know, I've never seen that on a blockchain. I've seen,
Yeah.
control keys for the network get compromised. I've seen smart contract keys get compromised. I've seen, bugs in smart contracts, but I've never seen, I know Shane's public address and I can just take money out of it, as far as I know.
Yeah, that would be bad. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, what else? Like you said, you're going to a bunch of these conferences. You were down in the Bahamas for the Salt conference. You're quite plugged in. I'm always surprised by how many conversations you have in a given day, and all of the people that you keep in touch with. So what given all of that, what's the interesting stuff to you? What are you excited about that's going to be coming down the pipeline in the next year ish?
Well, I'm honestly excited for it to be the winter because it's a
Yeah.
place where the real projects get much louder, and
Hmm.
the things that are sort of taking up the oxygen in the room that are sort of like being very loud but not actually adding value to the ecosystem. Those are less loud during the winter. So I think that's a place that I'm really excited is that we're in the build time right now, and
Hmm.
projects like MobileCoin are building really hard. There's a question in the audience about with all the straw polls coming up from the world of politics, is it possible for MobileCoin to offer their encrypted, fast, and secured services? Obviously, it wouldn't be money, but votes instead. I'm not sure what that is about votes, but I will talk about whether we're going to be able to offer what MobileCoin does long term. And my
Hmm.
answer here is quite simple. Governments, individuals, people all over the world, they have one thing in common, and that's that they all like privacy. And so
Hmm.
my perspective
Hmm.
on this is that we're delivering the maximum amount of privacy possible within the rule of law. And that's
Yeah.
this difficult line, this kind of ride. But if we nail that, then not only do you have money that protects your privacy, but you can spend it anywhere. And that's the difficult thing
Interesting.
that we're trying to deliver.
Yeah. Yeah. And could you talk a little more about that? Because I think that's something that lots of people are extremely interested in, and that has been one of the long term promises of cryptocurrency. It's this idea that once you've got something, you can spend it the way you want, you can store it the way you want, and you're not reliant on other organizations to be
Yeah.
an intermediary.
So I think the punchline is actually pretty simple. The punchline is that if you interact with an institution like FTX, FTX needs to know who you are if you're transacting in any real amount of money. Even like a $500,000. They need to know who you are.
Hmm.
So I think that when you interact with an institution that has a privilege of having licenses for money transmission, the privilege of having access to like very strong banking services, they need to know who you are. And there's a difference between Josh sending Shane money and Josh interacting with FTX. And so I think the real difference that we're going to see is that institutional interaction in crypto is going to feel very similar to the world before crypto. And peer to
Hmm.
peer interactions are going to feel, I think, very different. And that's kind of where I think the line is drawn. So when you want access to banking services, then you really need to de anonymize yourself. If you want to use decentralized services and their peer-to-peer actions, I think there's a lot more freedom that individuals are allowed around the world. And we see this in the construction of law around the world. We see this in the way that governments interact. And I frankly think that there's this interesting place where people with power have privacy. They have it by default. And people
Mm.
without power lack privacy in a lot of their lives. And so I
Hmm.
think what technologies like MobileCoin are trying to do is level that playing field. We're trying to give
Yeah.
people that are individuals some of the same powers that people who are, extremely wealthy, extremely powerful have today. Now there are limits, right? You can't interact with an institution without de-anonymizing yourself. There's just not really any way to do it. And I think that's
Hmm.
okay.
That's super interesting. Yeah, that's your idea, or that you expressed, that about sort of um, uh, when you have a greater access to resources, you have a greater access to privacy. I'm just thinking of some, there are some, in the US, some opinions out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals where I can't remember if it was majority or dissent, but like one of the Ninth Circuit judges had basically called that out and wrote an opinion on, this is on a Fourth Amendment case, that said basically like, well, look, like, we're judges. We have big houses. We have gates around our houses. We have a whole organization of federal law enforcement that's devoted to keeping us safe, and we have all these layers of privacy because we're judges, and like the average person doesn't have that. And so I think it's cool that there are companies out in the world trying to give the average person some of that privacy that a very few people traditionally have access to.
Well, I just remember when James Clapper said something in front of Congress. He was the head of the NSA at the time. He said something in Congress about needing to be able to see every message on every end-to-end encrypted service. And I remember Moxie, who's the author of Signal, posted on Twitter. He says, when James Clapper says he wants to be able to read Signal messages, I really wish I could read James Clapper's Signal messages in that moment. Can you just imagine a world where like you could read everyone's private messages, like you could read everyone's diary, you could see every payment they make? Would that be a world where we had any possibility of freedom whatsoever? And my
Yeah.
answer, I don't think you would. I don't think you'd have any freedom in a world where every message and every payment, every interaction people had was searchable in a database.
Hmm. Hmm. And I
I
know
don't,
you've spoken about this before, and it's probably a good thing for you to just reiterate, where you've used these examples of sort of historical movements in America that were largely funded, or were funded with cash, and weren't, and these are things sort of like, I don't know, you can speak about it more
well, let me
eloquently
just
than
give,
me. Yeah.
I think all change in society depends on privacy.
Yeah.
I think you have to have some semblance of privacy to be able to have any sort of change. And I'll give you some examples. Women's suffrage, the ability for women to vote in America, required women to be able to purchase picket signs and write messages
Hmm.
on them, to gather in private and form narratives that they could agree on, and to discuss times when they're going to assemble in public to demonstrate. The same thing with interracial marriage. Interracial
Hmm.
marriage required interracial relationships, which were illegal at the time in most
Hmm.
places in the United States. The same thing with minority rights in America. In order for African Americans to be able to band together and march on Washington, they had to have privacy to form into a coalition. And I think without privacy, the world is a place that does not change. And that dramatically benefits the people in power. But the thing that's the reality is that the people in power change all the time. And so I think it's important for people to be able to have a conversation with their government. I think it's important for people to be able to attempt to narrate the changes that they want to see in their society and to push for them. And
Hmm.
so I think if you don't have privacy, we sort of know what that world looks like, and it's a place that doesn't change. And I am not excited about that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's a good. Also, your comment on, in America, the change of administration having this vast impact on sort of what gets enforced and what doesn't get enforced is really relevant in the computer space, because I don't know if you saw, and this has some relevance to people doing security research in crypto, that the DOJ recently updated their guidelines for what will and will not be prosecuted. I believe under CFAA, as sort of, they basically changed the rules on white hat hacking, and they said,
Yeah.
okay, we're not prosecuting white hat hacking, but that's basically a something decided by the president. And so
Yeah.
kind of in my little legal world, a bunch of people are like, well, does this mean that you can do this? And I'm like, well, you can do it for the next 2 years, and then
Yeah, you
after
got 2
that,
years.
maybe you
It's
can't,
cycle.
maybe you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you bring up these interesting questions. Like if you do something today, 3 years from now, could a different DOJ come around and say like, oh wait, no, we changed our mind.
This is the thing about governing through the executive branch and not the legislative branch, is that
Yeah.
those policies are good for, at most 4 years,
Yep.
at most.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's very scary to operate in a world where things can change, every 4 years.
Yeah.
And as an organization that's dwelling in this sort of like regulatory wilderness, if we aren't going to see policy come out from legislature, then you have a period of time where you're like, okay, this is the policy until there's a regime change. And that is a very interesting place to operate in. It's hard to feel safe to operate there. I've always said that if we had regulatory clarity in crypto, everything would be super easy.
Yep. Well, why don't we talk about that a little bit, and then we'll see if there's any questions that people who are listening have. I see there's a couple up there already. You can drop them in the comment section, and we'll get them over to Josh. So you have been talking about regulations a lot, and the sort of surprising lack of movement over the last 4 or 5 years in American cryptocurrency regulation. What would you like to see? Like if you could wave a magic wand and get a set of crypto regulations. I mean, maybe you'd want the status quo and still have nothing, but what would you like to see coming out of DC?
I mean, the easiest thing is I would like to see a legal way to issue digital assets in the United States,
That
like a
would be
clearly
nice.
legal way.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that is table stakes. It's incredibly insane to me that we're 5 years, 10 years. What are we now? 15 years into cryptocurrency existing as a technology. Like
hmm
it's 2008 for the Bitcoin white paper, right? We're coming
yep,
up on a decade and a half, right? And it's crazy to me that we're that far in, and there's no way to issue a digital asset that's like obviously legal in the United States. There just
yeah,
isn't. There
yeah,
just isn't one.
yeah. And
And
like you and I were in DC. What was that? 2018, 2019, when we were, you and I went to DC and talked to a bunch of members of Congress and staffers
yeah,
about this, and still nothing.
so I think that's like the first thing I would like to see is just a clear, obvious way that you can issue a digital asset that is separate from the way that like other assets are issued in the world, because they have to recognize the unique properties of digital assets. So that's thing number one. I
hmm
would also love to see like a way that we could understand what the relationship of stable coins that are issued by crypto companies is to the US dollar. What is that
hmm
actual relationship like? And I think
Yeah.
there's so many different moving parts there that it's hard to see what the reality of that is going to be. Like,
Okay.
bank collateralization is very different from crypto collateralization on cryptocurrencies. Like if you look at Tether, it's maybe more collateralized than a lot of banks are, which is a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that's true because I think broadly speaking in the United States, the minimum collateral ratio for federally chartered banks is like 8%. I think as
It's
of the
almost
latest
zero.
stress, yeah,
It's almost
as
zero.
of the latest stress test they were doing, I think the average big and large American bank is running like 14 or 15% collateralization. Tether, you and I've been talking about this in the last week or two. If you write down, if you apply some discount to the commercial paper that Tether holds, their $20 billion in commercial paper, like say that's all
19, 18,
Evergrande.
17.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so say you write down 25% of it, they still have God, I can't remember, something like 40 or $50 billion in cash. So even a largely pessimistic view would be that their cash backing fraction is something north of 50%, which you know
Which is my point on Tether is that they can survive a bank run as a percentage of assets much more than a bank can.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, the big banks, they do have the one major advantage, which is that they've got access to the Fed overnight discount window.
That's right.
So if they needed $100 billion, there is an organization standing behind them that could hand that out if they needed to. But it, like you said, and not to take away from your point, that would be hugely disruptive.
Well, maybe not to every bank at once at the same time, right? But that's
Yeah,
a
well,
larger
yeah, well,
situation.
that was like going back to 2008 and the Washington Mutual example. that is the one really interesting thing, which is that part of the reason why there was the sort of government negotiated auction and sale of WAMU's assets to Chase was that there was a fear that the FDIC backstop wasn't sufficiently collateralized to make whole all of WAMU's customers. Again, like that included me. If the bank actually did fail and they did kind of an FDIC mediated restructuring, and then there was like 10 years of litigation over whether or not that forced auction was legally proper. So I mean, there's a lot going on behind the scenes in those.
Well, in those moments, they say that possession is 9/10 of the law, and it's certainly true that WAMU no longer possesses WAMU after that sale, right?
Yeah, it's all Chase now. Yeah. Again, if anyone has any questions for Josh, you can type them in. So we've got one question up here where someone is asking about MobileCoin and politics, and they want to know if MobileCoin's technology could have any application to voting. You and I both know that digital voting of any kind is just fraught with peril. There's a famous XKCD comic on this that basically says like no.
Well, the problem isn't with blockchain. The problem is in the blockchain, right? Like that's not the solution to voting, because the problem with this is identity.
Yeah.
Like you need to be able to have a provable identity in a distributed environment. And this goes back to the soul-bound NFT problem, right? If you don't know who is casting a vote, it doesn't matter how good your vote counting software is.
Yep, for sure. It's actually, it's kind of interesting that came up. So we're in San Francisco. We have an election coming up in 6 days. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm going to be a poll worker for the first time. And I am, elections get a bad rap in America. Like the mechanics of elections for some very valid reasons. But I was really shocked to kind of go through the poll worker training and actually learn like how much infrastructure and how many people there are working extremely hard to pull off something like even just like a local municipal election in San Francisco. And it actually it kind of makes me feel better a little bit about voting, at least here in California, to realize kind of like how many layers of checks and balances there are. There's this giant chunk in the manual on the proper handling of CF cards coming out of the voting machine, which is nice to see. And yes, we are using Dominion brand voting machines, so hopefully the connection to the orbital space laser will work.
So we're about 18 minutes over on time right now. Right. I just want to say that I have loved this conversation, Shane. This has been a total blast. Thank you so much.
Me too. Yeah, thank you so much also. It's been fun, and maybe we'll do it again.
Wonderful. And if anybody has any questions, you can hit us up on Twitter. You can join us on Discord. I'm at the PBX guy. Shane, what's your Twitter tag? I always screw this up. Sorry.
I am at Chief No Officer, which was a joke from when Josh and I used to work together, because I was always the person saying no.
Operations, right?
That's true.
Yeah. All right. You can also follow us at MobileCoin, and you can join us on Discord. We'll be around answering questions. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.
Take care. Bye.